I'm Michelle Berry, Senior Associate Dean for Global Health, and I'd like to welcome you to this conversation in global health. These are quarterly events in which we invite world leaders to tell us their personal story and to discuss their careers. We hope these conversations inspire students and show them ways they can use their education to actually improve health and well-being worldwide. I'd also like to thank the team at Stanford, the Center of Global Poverty and Development, for all of their hard work and support in co-sponsoring this event. It's my great pleasure to introduce Dr. Yong Kim, and he is the 12th president of the World Bank, as one probably knows in this room. He's a physician and an anthropologist, but he's really dedicated his entire career to actually improving the lives of the poor. Later at the World, even when he was a medical student at Harvard, he was able to co-found Partners in Health with Paul Farmer, who many of you know because he's a frequent visitor at Stanford. But this is a nonprofit, again, that works in poor communities in 4 continents. Later at the World Health Organization, Dr. Kim led the first ever global goal for AIDS treatment, which expanded access to antiretroviral medications in developing countries. He's held professorships at Harvard Medical School, Harvard School of Public Health, and he's actually even been a president of Dartmouth College. When Dr. Kim became president of the World Bank, this is an organization that he decided would have 2 goals to guide its work. One, to end extreme poverty by 2030, and to boost shared prosperity. As part of that effort, he's introducing the Human Capital Index, an ambitious effort to accelerate each country's investment in people. He's been named many things, including a MacArthur Genius, a 25 of the best leaders in the world, and one of Times Magazine 100 people. So please welcome Dr. Kim. I'd also like to introduce Dr. Paul Wise, one of our core faculty members at the Center of Global Health and a senior fellow at the Freeman Spogli Institute. Paul is a professor of pediatrics and, as many of you know, has dedicated his entire career to health, education, and improving the lives of the poor. He's worked with children in conflict zones in the Middle East and Central America, and most recently, he's worked with children in detention centers along the U.S. border in Texas. Paul and Jim have known each other for, 30 years? Over 30 years?
At least years, yeah.
So we thought it was a really special treat to conduct this conversation between them. So thank you both. Paul.
Thank you, Michelle. Well, Jim, welcome. As you can see, there are a lot of young faces in this audience. There are students, trainees, junior faculty who are interested in your personal journey, how you've been able to integrate what for most people would seem like distinct disciplines, anthropology, medicine, university president, and now global banker. What kind of guidance could you provide people early in their careers about how to prepare oneself for creating such a integrated, focused commitment?
Well, there's really 2 things. And one of the things, I'm here because I gave what's called a pre-positioning speech. And every year I give a speech right before our annual meetings to sort of outline what the issues are going to be. And so this year's World Development Report and the focus of the meetings is on the future of work. And so I really felt like there was a huge problem in terms of the preparation of people in developing countries to compete in the economy of the future. But in looking at the future of the work, what kept coming out over and over and over again is that it's not so much what you study, it's having the ability to learn throughout your whole life. Right? And so we know, and Paul, you're the master, you know this better than I, but much better than I, but what happens in the first 1,000 days is critical for developing your ability to keep learning. And so I'm sure all of you here have the ability to keep learning, But what sometimes throws you off is that if you're confronted with a completely different area, it's very hard to humble yourself to start from scratch and really learn that area. Right? And so I've done it so many times. I've learned 2 languages after the age of 24. I spoke Korean as a kid, but I completely forgot it. So at the age of 24, I had to go back to Korea and learn Korean from the beginning. And when you spoke Spanish beautifully, I didn't speak a word. And when I was in my late 20s, I started learning Spanish. You remember that by being in Peru. So those are 2 experiences. But then, I had to learn the World Health Organization, and then I had to learn, although I was an infectious disease doctor, I didn't really understand all the intricacies of the tuberculosis world and the HIV world, and I had to learn that. And then I had to learn how to be a college president, which I never really learned very well. Let me tell you, that's the hardest job on earth. I was with Mark Tessier-Levine, and there are people like Mark who are just so good at doing this. And the president of my alma mater, Brown, Chris Paxton, is another person who's just so good at being diplomatic and yet substantive. I mean, it's just really hard, right? I wasn't very good at it. But that experience taught me a lot. It taught me about managing endowments. It taught me about we had I think something like 5,000 staff, and then at the World Bank, what I had to dig into was macroeconomics and finance. Those were, and then I learned transport, I learned energy, I learned a lot of different things, but the macro and finance was really, really tough. And I literally, in my first couple of months, I went to Khan Academy, and I did macro and finance off Khan Academy to start with, right? And then what I did was I had seminars, and I had to be humble enough, and Ed Hsu back in the back remembers this. He used to organize these meetings where I just bring people in and ask stupid questions. Well, what does that mean? And how? What do you think? When you say that there's no price elasticity, what does that actually mean? And I learn best when I hear it directly from the experts, and so I did that. It took some humility, but now I really feel like it's hard and it's incredibly humbling. But it's almost like having an anthropological experience every few years, right? Because anthropologists, when you go to a country or a place where you don't speak the language, you don't know the culture, you feel like you're a baby. And so you have to start taking the first steps. I learned Spanish completely through the Pimsleur program. And the Pimsleur program teaches you Spanish as if you were a child learning it for the first time. And so I guess that's what I've done. And the other part of it is just when people ask you to do things that sound impossible, say yes. Right? Say yes, and then give it a shot. Just give it a shot. Now my role is much more trying to take away obstacles from the great staff at the World Bank from accomplishing things. And then when there is a really good idea that just seems really hard, going through the first 15 times that they tell me it's impossible and continuing to push them to do it, right? Pandemic insurance. We created pandemic insurance, and at least 15 times they came to me and said, it's just impossible. Right? I said, sorry, go back, go back and do it again. Famine insurance and a famine action mechanism where we were using AI to detect famines earlier. And, having the humility to be really clear about what you know and what you don't know, and then asking questions and then believing that you can get better is important. Carol Dweck is here, right, somewhere at Stanford? Right?
Yes.
I just think her research is so interesting. I discovered it when I was at Dartmouth. And it's like, the growth mindset is the most important thing, and you should never lose it. In any stage of your life, you should never lose it. I have quoted her so many times. I've never met her, I've never talked to her on the phone, but I think that's important, and it's not only important for you; it's important for the world. The World Bank said that Korea was a basket case, that there was no way Korea would develop. Korea wasn't eligible for World Bank loans until '63 because they thought there was no hope of them ever paying back a loan. Right? And so that's not very growth mindset, way of thinking about countries. And so I believe that any country can get better. And I also believe that I can learn how to do just about anything, not at the level of an expert, but let me put it this way. I feel confident now that I can go through the experience of being completely humbled as I take on something new.
Let me just take a step back and recognize what just happened. A Harvard physician, professor, a former university president, and a global banker is stressing humility as the secret for an integrated, focused commitment.
Let me take it a bit further, right? So I have a coach, right? I have a leadership coach named Marshall Goldsmith. He's the most celebrated leadership coach in the world. They now have named the annual prize that they give to coaches the Marshall Goldsmith Prize. And his most important, the thing that he's known for is to literally have the top CEOs in the world, on their knees begging for mercy as he gives them their 360 feedback. And he's incredibly good at getting all of your direct reports and even your bosses to give searingly direct feedback about the crazy things you're doing that you think that nobody really noticed, right? You know you're doing them, but you don't think anyone's really noticing. He gives it to you right between the eyes, and literally I've seen people walk out of his feedback sessions almost crawling, right? And he's Buddhist. Right? So he grew up as in Kentucky as a fundamentalist Christian from a very poor community in Kentucky. He rejected it, became a Buddhist, and his Buddhist belief is everyone can change. Everyone's different from one moment to the next. Your behaviors of yesterday and the day before are not determining your behaviors of the future. Get better. If you care, get better. Right? So after having gone through so many sessions like that, it's dawned on me that leadership is all about being humble enough to take real feedback and changing your behavior. Right? So it's not easy. It's still incredibly difficult, and Marshall still gives it to me. When he first was giving me feedback, I was so defensive. I said, well, Marshall, maybe you don't understand Asian people. So, you want me to tell you the list of leaders in China, Japan, Korea, and India that I've coached over the last, But it's because you're rendered completely defenseless, and then he of course builds you back up and says, but they think that you can get better, and here are the 5 things. And the first thing you have to do, you have to go back to your team and say, okay, I heard you. I know that I've done things that aren't very good. Can you help me to get better? Which is even harder to do. Right? And so now Marshall is. He said, Jim, I think the next stage of my life, I want to give away all my coaching knowledge to others who want to learn from me. And so he thought, I'm going to maybe get about 15 people, and I'm going to put out an announcement. I'll probably get 50 or 60 applications, and then we'll form this little group, and can you help me? I said, oh, sounds great. So he put out this little notice. 15,000 people applied. Right? And so now he has the Marshall Goldsmith 100, and there's now a group of people who want to go out and help others get better. So it's a medical school, and when I was at Dartmouth, the students and faculty used to say, he has a coach. We want a president who doesn't need a coach, right? And it got worse than that. Our board was saying, leadership's so important, and we want to give you a major grant. It was like $30 or $40 million to help students learn about leadership. And again, leadership is about self-awareness, ability to work in teams, all things that every single institution needs desperately. And the faculty, when I suggested to the faculty, they said, what are you talking about? We would never approve that. I said, well, why? They said, we hate leadership. What do you mean you hate leadership? Leadership suggests followership. And we teach every student to not follow anybody and make up their own mind on things. Right? So that is not a very humble way of approaching the task of getting really big things done. If you want to get real, if you want to be a professor who is always right and who wins all the seminar room wars, then do that. But if you really want to accomplish something like ending poverty in the world, you not only you have to learn how to be humble, but you have to learn how to help other people to get to that stage.
You've emphasized humility and the ability to change, but a central theme, a central focus, discipline, even vision throughout your career early on, Partners in Health, and consistently since I've known you, has been an embrace of the preferential option for the poor as a guiding vision. How has your understanding and your obligation regarding preferential option for the poor changed, and how has it been maintained consistently through these different stages of leadership and contribution?
Yeah, the Partners in Health, we had people from every different faith: Christians, Jews, Hindus, Muslims. We had people from every different background, but it came from graduate school, really. Paul Farmer and I were both anthropology graduate students, and so we studied all the great ideas of the time. Habermas's notion of communication, and Pierre Bourdieu's notion of doxa and cultural capital, and we studied everything. And we studied all these different ways of how you should shape the world, but we didn't find any idea that we thought was better than the notion of a preferential option for the poor. And it was really a very simple idea. And it was among the Latin American priests in the Catholic Church. And they just wanted to make a very specific point to the Latin American Bishops' Conference. And their point was, if Jesus were alive today, where would he be? Would he be, and the implication was, where all of you are, hanging out with the elites, hanging out with the generals, or would he be living in the poorest communities? They say, we think the biblical evidence is overwhelming that he would have been living and working with the poor. And he wouldn't have hated the rich. He wouldn't have castigated necessarily the rich just because they were rich, but he would have had a preference for the poor. Very simple idea. And, after reading, all the pre-Marx himself, the post-Marxist, the post-structure, after reading all those folks, we thought that idea was so simple and so powerful. And it was so powerful because of what it was not. Right? So I don't know if we ever told you the story, but we got a letter from a high school student whose parents had donated to Partners in Health. And the letter said, I'd like to go to Haiti. I'd like to go this summer. I'll spend 3 weeks. I'd like to see patients, preferably on my own. Right? But a translator would be helpful. Right? And literally, the kid was saying, I know you guys are like doing something heroic, and I think it's your responsibility to facilitate my experience of heroism. Right? And we used to say, and people would come to Partners in Health all the time and say, I want to be like Paul. I want to do that. I want to be heroic like that. And we would say, but wait a minute. Think about it. It's a preferential option for the poor. It's not a preferential option for your heroism. Right? It's not a preferential option for your idea. It's not a preferential option for your intervention or your organization. And mostly, the most important thing is it's not a preferential option for your poor. It's a preferential option for the poor. Much harder, right? What can we do now that will have implications for all the poor people in the world, right? And you go to a meeting of anthropologists. Well, in my community, blah 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 blah. Well, no, in my community, it's not. It's taking the question of, so what do we do about poverty and inequality in the world? And so what we had decided was, there's no money for global health. And when we started, remember, Paul, it was like a couple $100 million in the world. We said, there's never going to be much money for global health. But we're going to go forward and we're going to say we make a preferential option for the poor. We're going to provide care for as much as we possibly can with whatever money we raise. And we're going to refuse to accept that because they're poor, they're going to get poor quality care. And that's what we thought we'd do. We thought we're going to always be on the side of the losers. We're never going to have much money. We're never going to be celebrated in academia. We're just going to stay with the poor. But it worked. And we started seeing the money flow. And we started... we got a $45 million grant for tuberculosis, and you were there for that. We couldn't believe it. And so things started happening, but the preferential option for the poor idea never changed. Right? And so now I'm saying, the responsibility to make a preferential option for the poor, because everything's changing so rapidly, technology is changing, The number of people are growing. Everyone's going to have access to broadband. Everyone's aspirations are going up. Now, the preferential option for the poor means we've got to make global market capitalism work for everybody on the planet. And the people who were never really behind preferential option for the poor would say things like, well, what about the critique of capitalism, right? I said, well, I go to China and Vietnam, the communist parties, and they don't care at all about critiquing capitalism. They want to know how they can integrate themselves more effectively in the global market system to lift more people out of poverty. Because it is Xi Jinping, the head of the largest communist party in the world, said in January of 2017, right before the inauguration of President Trump, the global system is the ocean we all swim in. Any effort to turn it back into lakes and streams will fail. You cannot stop the flow of people, of capital, of ideas, of trade. So that was the head of the largest communist party in the world. And every time I go there, they say, we want to lift more of our people out of poverty. How can we integrate into the system better? Now, the people who weren't all the way there for preferential option for the poor, for the P we called it, saying, well, yeah, but what about... Paul got it like that, right? So Paul, because Paul said, of course, Jim, that's what you should do, and that's exactly the right thing. And the way I say it is, okay, I'm not ideologically telling you that you need to think capitalism is the greatest thing. I don't. But I was trained in two things. I was trained in ethnography as an anthropologist, and I was trained in looking at the evidence from medicine. And if you do those two things, and then you go and you meet with the Vietnamese party chief and the Chinese party chief, and all they want to know is, how can we do it better? Because we need to create more jobs. We need to create more economic growth so that we can lift people out of poverty. How do we do it better? It shows you that the evidence has been revealed, and we're not arguing about capitalism versus socialism anymore. We're saying this is the system that exists. How can you make it work for the poorest? So those who were making a preferential option for their own political ideas, they don't get this. Paul, no problem.
You stress in several of your talks and writings the importance of mobilizing global markets, capital markets, to address the needs of the poorest. However, those capital markets, those global systems, tend to be extremely risk averse. And many of us are very worried about the concentration of intense need to areas of violent conflict and profound political instability. So how do you develop at the World Bank and in other ways, how do you develop mechanisms to facilitate the integration or at least the relevance of these global markets to places that are under enormous stress and conflict?
For me, one of the great experiences of coming to the World Bank Group was to learn about all these amazing tools that rich people use every day to make themselves richer. I just couldn't believe how cool they were. Swaps and first loss instruments and guarantees and leveraging yourself just up the wazoo because you have a track record and you only have to have a tiny bit of capital to get all kinds of other capital. I just couldn't believe that these things were real, and we use them somewhat for the poor, but not enough, right? So, insurance, right? Rich people insure themselves against everything. The poor people are usually insured against nothing. So we created a pandemic insurance, and it came about because I went and talked to the two largest reinsurance industries. The reinsurance industries are the ones that insure other insurers. And I said, would you guys be interested in pandemic insurance? They said, well, we've never done that before, but hey, if you can just come up with an annual likelihood of an event happening on any given year, we can insure anything. Right? And so we forced people to sit in a room for a long time, and they came up with the annual incidence of coronavirus, filovirus, and polymyxoviruses. And we then went to the bond markets, and they just put out the results of their investigation, saying it's about 3.7% a year, and what it took was 8.7% interest a year. Right? So, in other words, some of them were very happy about being able to purchase a pandemic bond. Others didn't care. They just wanted the return. And this was 3 years capital at risk because they could have lost all of it. But they were so desperate for return that we had more than double the interest than the bonds we had to sell. And so it taught me something, which is we're not asking enough questions. We're not being aggressive enough at seeing if we can make this kind of stuff work even in the most difficult situations. So it turns out we at the World Bank have so many different tools to de-risk. So the first is often the policy structure is terrible. It makes no sense. It comes from colonial, the history of colonialism, and they need to change their policies. We can actually give money directly to the budgets of countries and help them change their policies. We can provide partial risk guarantees. In other words, we can say, okay, so these people need $500 million. We will guarantee 300 million of it. We'll say that if this country is not able to pay back loans on 300 million of it, we'll provide a guarantee. And that makes it possible for them to get those loans. We can provide political risk insurance. In other words, if a government nationalizes your company or there's some kind of a natural disaster or even war, we will actually pay you the value of your investment. And most people don't know about these things and don't use them. So we have more than doubled our commitment to fragile and conflict-affected areas. That's what we're supposed to do. But if you look at those fragile and conflict-affected areas, there is no way that they're going to get back on their feet unless we make markets work in those countries. There's just no amount of aid that's going to stop them from being fragile and conflict-affected. And so we're, our IFC, our private sector group, at potential huge losses for them, are now in those countries trying to create businesses. And we're trying to work with people like Jack Ma, Alibaba, who has done incredible things in improving access to capital and markets for Chinese farmers living in very poor areas. And so we've got to try to find something because the needs are so huge and official development assistance has topped out at about 140 billion a year. And I don't see a single country in the world that's saying, hey, let's raise our taxes and give more to the poor. There's not a single country doing that. UK did it for about 3 years, and they did raise their overall allotment to 0.7, but boy, that is under threat right now. Yeah.
One of the tools...
Does anyone... I hope I'm not going off in tangents that don't make any sense, but...
Well, that's my fault
if
you do. But we'll have plenty of opportunity for a Q&A and to get us back on track to address your concerns, actually, in just in a few minutes.
But the point is, I feel so silly that I did not learn how money works in the world until I was in my 50s. It's just so stupid, right? And it's not about becoming a capitalist and loving money. It's like, this is how the world works. Do you want to know how the world works, or do you not want to know how the world? It's not how the whole world works, but it's so important, and there's so many tools that the rich use all the time that can be used for the poor. And so I'm just telling you, this is, if you want to make a preferential option for your own stylish ability to critique whatever, that's one thing. But if you want to make a preferential option for, you have no choice. You got to learn this. Yeah.
One of the tools the World Bank has utilized quite well is the development of metrics, of indices that provide insight into both the success and continued challenges that countries face. The bank and you certainly have stressed investment in human capital, and you have coming out really in just a couple of weeks a new human capital index. Could you talk a little bit more about what you mean by human capital and how this index hopefully will generate the kind of response you're hoping for?
So when you're calculating the wealth of nations, you look at essentially three major kinds of capital. Produced capital, that's like infrastructure, machines, roads, rails. There's natural capital, it's the natural resources and how well you maintain them. And there's a third, human capital. Human capital is the productive capacity of people. And the productive capacity of people is determined by what we have found is the quality of their education and especially the quality of the healthcare in the first 5 years and then mortality. That's the description of it. Let me tell you why we did it. I spent 30 years very often with Paul arguing as loud as we could that donors need to give more for health and education because we just didn't think the resources existed in developing countries to do it. And I think in many ways we were right. But here's what's happened. There's something that economists call moral hazard. And moral hazard is that your behavior, you engage in aberrant behaviors because you're covered by something else like insurance. And so what happened was that we saw extremely low commitments of actual country budgets to health and education, and everyone, and these leaders, especially heads of state and ministers of finance, were very happy to sing along with the activists. Yeah, we need more money for health and education. They didn't spend their own, though. And so now we went from a couple $100 million to maybe $25 billion just for health, but that's not nearly enough to prepare the young people of today for the jobs of tomorrow. It's nowhere near enough. India has a 38% childhood stunting rate. Indonesia, 37%. China, interestingly, less than 7%. Vietnam, 20%, but going down. These countries are living in a disaster. You guys know what childhood stunting is. We've done longitudinal studies of what happens when children are stunted. They learn less and they earn less. We know that from many, many independent studies. And there's just nowhere near enough money. And why were they not focusing on childhood stunting? Why were they not focusing on ECD? Why were they not focusing on the quality of education? Because we weren't holding them to account. There was no accountability mechanism. And when they came to us, they always, or let me not say always, but they so often chose the road, often which went either to their hometowns or to the districts that they lost in the last election. Right? Or they want, the one country had meter gauge rail, which works just fine. This leader, almost as a vanity project, wanted standard gauge rail, which is wider than 1 meter. Right? And these were things that they felt are more, they're palpable. You can see them. They're going to help me win the next election. So I thought we have to have something that will cause these leaders to think again about investing in their people. And the thing that does it is rankings. And what's going to happen is that countries are going to find that they're ranked below other countries to which they've always felt superior. And the opposition parties are going to go crazy and say, you see, look at where we're ranked, this is terrible. And I don't know if it'll work. In many interesting ways, it's already started working. I announced that we were going to do this Human Capital Index last year in the fall, and the requests for financing for health and education went up 70% just in the last year. Right? And when it comes out, what they'll see is you cannot get better on the list unless you actually improve outcomes. 4 things: learning adjusted years of schooling, stunting, child mortality, and adult mortality. Just 4 things. And so unless you improve on those 4 things, you're not going to go up the rankings. So you can't game the system. You actually have to improve outcomes. Now, I feel like I contributed to the movement of the world of global health and global education into one that was very focused on supply and input. And now what I'm trying to do is change it to one that's focused on demand and outcome. So, already there people in a very large country have come to me and said, this is really problematic for us because just imagine what the opposition party will do with this. And I very quietly, without saying it out loud, I said, yes, exactly. You're going to have a different conversation now about investing in your people. And what we hope is they'll come to us and say, okay, this is terrible. We're embarrassed by this. How can we improve our ranking? I said, there's only one way, actually improve your outcomes. And so that's why I'm doing it. And it's like, I hope it's going to turn into a real contribution. I mean, there are people, very famous, well-known people out there in the world who still say, well, if we just doubled our ODA and, for the cost of a popcorn and a soda pop, you can't do it with that. You just cannot do it with that, right? And it will just make the moral hazard risk worse because they'll go back and say, yeah, you see, these very famous people are saying it's not our responsibility, it's the responsibility of donors. Nigeria, we spend 19% of GDP on healthcare. Nigeria spends 0.76%, right? And every dollar of it comes from the World Bank. Right? They collect, so the standard assumption is that you have to collect 15% of GDP in taxes, or you cannot provide the basic minimum of services. That's the average in middle-income countries. Nigeria collects 5% of GDP on taxes. And Nigeria, like so many other poor countries, only collect taxes from people who are too weak to refuse to pay taxes. Everyone else just doesn't pay, right? And so if these countries got rid of fossil fuel subsidies help the richest 20% 6 times more than the poorest 20%. If they got rid of agricultural subsidies, which almost all go to the cronies of the government who are very comfortable, thank you. If you added a tobacco tax, all those things together, improve your tax collection, get rid of stupid subsidies, add a tobacco tax, they will be able to pay for health and education. And we'll help them do it. Right? So it's so different. And again, you know, I have activist friends. The activist friends are saying, you're so wrong on this. What you need to do is classify all the middle-income countries as low-income countries so they can still get cheap loans. And I'm saying, are you kidding me? You know, we have to attack this from many different angles. We have to continue to ask for more financing, but we also have to hold heads of state and ministers of finance accountable for what they do for their populations. And look, you know, the first time I met Prime Minister Modi, I told him, you have an emergency on your hands. 38% childhood stunting is just awful. You know, what are they going to do? What are these children going to do when they become 25 and 30, when the Indian economy has evolved tremendously, low-skilled agricultural jobs go away? You know, it doesn't look like you're going to have huge manufacturing jobs. And by the way, those manufacturing jobs are requiring more skills every year. What are they going to do? And I said, these people, 38%, that's going to be the focus of instability in your country. You have to do this. Right? So anyway, India has made more investments, very much investing in sanitation and other things, but it's not enough. It's not enough. And so this is going to be incredibly controversial. I think there will be leaders in countries who are calling for my head. But, you know.
Wouldn't be the first time.
Wouldn't be the first time. Wouldn't be the first time. And anyway, we'll change the conversation anyway.
We have time for one last question from me before we open it up. And that question is basically to give you an opportunity for you to convey the single most important message that you want to convey to an audience like this about the future and the best way to stick to their core values, but at the same time prepare for a very dynamic future likely to come.
Yeah. So I would just say, you know, for the medical students, you know, it's almost crazy to think that there was a time when there wasn't evidence-based medicine, but we remember that time. It was like in the 80s, right? You know, Howard Hyatt started the first program for teaching, you know, clinical research. And this was in 1982. And they said, are you kidding, Howard? We'd never allow our students to do clinical research. They're all going to do molecular biology, right? And so now you can't imagine that, but clinical research, actually looking at which interventions led to the best outcomes, that's relatively new in medicine. But it's such a great training for you guys. Do the same when you're thinking about poverty or global health, right? And it's amazing, really smart medical students who in front of a patient will look at all the different data, look at all the different possibilities, try to do the best for the patient. When they get to global health, it's like, well, I'm really excited about my project. And I really think you should do my project because it's really exciting for me. It's like, you know, I really feel like I can be heroic with this idea. It's not evidence-based, right? And so I would say, do the evidence-based work, but ask the big question. What am I doing? What am I here for? For me, it's very clear. It's still preferential option for the poor. And now I just have a lot bigger tools to tackle it. But it took changing my views on a lot of things, including the nature of the global market capitalist system, to come to where I am right now. And I'm sure it'll change even more over time. But the training you get in terms of looking at the evidence and then moving from the evidence to do the right thing based on, you know, values like, you've got to do no harm and do everything you can for the patient. Those are really great values and really great training to take you forward.
I think what we'll do now is open it for questions, but I'm going to take the first question if you don't mind. I love the idea of the Human Capital Index. I mean, you have no idea how much Stanford and other, I'm sure you do, Dartmouth, think about U.S. News World Report.
Absolutely. By the way, do you know what's the most powerful correlating factor in terms of where your ranking is in the U.S. News and World Report, best colleges? What you were ranked last year?
NIH funding per person, per capita.
It's what you were ranked last year.
Right.
Because I was one of the respondents, right? You're looking at how do I know how Towson State University should be ranked? So I look at the rankings and I rank them about where they were the year before.
Very fun.
Right?
Very
so
good.
It's so arbitrary. They changed technology this year, yeah, but
my question to you is, in your Human Capital Index, are you disaggregating data so that you can look at women and girls versus men?
Yes, we have a lot of disaggregated data. We try to do that with every single thing that we do at the World Bank Group. This first publication of the Human Capital Index in all of these areas, so the stunting data exists and it's disaggregated. Under 5 mortality exists and it's disaggregated. And also adult mortality is disaggregated. We're using just normal data sets. Learning adjusted years of schooling is really an assessment of school systems, right? And I don't know if we're going to give disaggregated data on that yet, but most of the data sets are disaggregated.
Yes. Yep. Questions? Yes. Oh, hi.
Thank you, Dr. Kim.
I know that at Stanford, everyone wears a long coat, including the medical students. So I can't tell from the long coat whether you're a student or a doctor.
Second year.
Attending. Second year, okay. Great.
And so my question is, you talked about moral hazard, and I just wanted to know and get a better understanding on your thought of how microfinancing and microcredit are going to affect the next 15 years or so as we push towards the Sustainable Development Goals.
So that's a perfect example of people who have made a preferential option for their own idea, right? So if you look at a guy like Faisal Abed, right? Faisal Abed is one of my heroes. And Faisal would say, microenterprise lending is good for some things. It's good to start, but it's not the only thing. And there are others, and I won't name them, but there are others who have argued that it's the answer to everything. It's not. What have we found? We found that microenterprise lending has almost never led to women moving into the formal labor market. It has almost never led to women who are mostly the recipients starting small and medium enterprises. It was good at reducing poverty for a while, but it didn't really lead to the next step. So people like Faisal Abed of BRAC and others have said, what's the next step? How do you move them to formality? And so there's a role for it, but I think it's a limited role. Right? It's a good start, but what you really want is for people to be able to get access to the kind of capital that will allow them to start a business. That's why we've started a women's entrepreneurship initiative to try to move capital to women who can start their own businesses. We started with nothing, and we now have about $4 or $5 billion that we're moving to these women. But I mean, the real model is Alibaba. Jack Ma says that you can go, if you're part of the Alibaba community and you've behaved well and paid everything off, you can receive as much as 1 million renminbi, which is about $150,000, in 2 seconds, right? Because they don't have to meet you and shake your hand, the normal banker, know your customer kind of thing. He knows from your online behavior how much money you can handle. So 2 seconds. And if you then take that money and create a small and medium enterprise that makes a good product, he will market it for you. He will give you access to every market in the world. He will give you marketing advice. He will advertise your things online. He'll help you to procure your materials for cheaper. He'll let you, he even has a program that lets you do your accounting online and get tutoring for how you do your accounting, right? And so that is so much more powerful than microenterprise lending. But the important thing is, I think that was one of the things that was thought of as an idea that's going to change the world. I'm very suspicious. And I'm especially suspicious of people who argue that it's their idea that's going to save the world. Anyway.
Is that?
Hi, thank you for coming. I used to work at the World Bank, and I left quite critical of the organization. So the bank's mission centers around poverty, but many people emphasize how the bank was a bank, and the lending side is incentivized to make more loans. And there's a poverty assessment at the end, but those people are long gone, and no one really reads those anyway. So I was on the research side, and that's supposed to be kind of a check on the lending side. And the rhetoric is about evidence-based policy, but the running joke was that the management was more interested in policy-based evidence. So I was skeptical.
When were you there, by the way?
2015, 2016. So I was still skeptical, and then our research was stopped because it threatened a loan that the World Bank wanted to make. And so overall, it seemed like there was that the incentives for the lending side took precedent over even censorship and pushing debt on poor countries. And so you used to be a critic of the World Bank, and I was wondering if you still share this critique, and if so, what you're doing to change it.
So that actually happens. You're right. I don't know the specific case. If it was ever brought to my attention, frankly, you were 15 levels down, so I wouldn't have interacted with you. It's just a fact, right? I would never. What happened to you would never, come to my desk, right? Unless you were a whistleblower, and then I would come to my desk, and I would have looked at it. But you're absolutely right, and that's why that's the biggest change we're trying to make at the bank, right? So the truth of the matter is that if there is a great project that's commercially viable, in other words, a country would never have to take a loan for it because we could make it work through the private sector, and it would probably lead to lower costs, better efficiency, and they wouldn't have to pay back a loan, right? But what happens is if there's something like that, all the development banks compete with each other to provide a sovereign guaranteed loan, a loan guaranteed by the country for a particular project, because it's easy, right? By definition, it's easy. And so the head of the IFC, our private sector group, came in the bank, and he used to work on the bank side. And he said, we talk about billions to trillions, we're going to scale up our investment, but we're doing just the opposite. Because there are all kinds of possibilities of bringing in private capital. And instead, you people on the bank side, you rush in and you give a sovereign guarantee loan because it's easier for everybody. And it's absolutely the wrong thing to do. And so we've established principles now at the World Bank Group. First is a cascade. The first question you have to ask is this commercially viable? And if it's commercially viable, all the development banks should make an ethical pledge not to provide a loan for it, because that's just increasing public debt when in fact you don't have to do that, and you can do it much better otherwise. This is new. This is new literally since 2015. We've been talking about this for 2 years. And it's the most difficult change. You will remember I was changing a lot of things at the bank in 2015 and 2016. Those things all led to a capital increase. We got the largest capital increase in the history of the bank in April. But the promise was that we would change the culture, right? So there was what was incentivized is getting a loan out the door. Now what we're trying to do is to say, nope, we're going to have an algorithm to determine how we're going to finance something. And this has to be shared across all the multilateral development banks, because the goal is maximizing finance for development, including for health and education. The only way countries are going to be able to pay for the health and education that they need is if they use the private sector to fund all the things that are commercially viable. So that critique, I don't know the particular project, so I don't know if it's valid for that project, but for all the multilateral development banks, it's absolutely valid, right? So let's see if this new approach, which is called the cascade and maximizing finance for development, really works. It's beginning to work, right? So let me give you an example. And this was before the cascade. King Abdullah, who's one of the nicest guys and I think greatest leaders, came to the bank and said, I want to fix Queen Ali International Airport. I want to build it anew. And so I want a loan from the bank. And one guy at the bank, who's this quirky, wonderful guy, said, I could give you a loan for it, but you don't need to take a loan. That Jordan has enough air traffic, you could just do it on commercial terms, and you might even make money off it, right? So he worked against his own interests. What's his name? Ed? John? You remember his name, right? I forget. I can't believe I forgot his name, right? But he became famous in the bank because I talked about him all the time, right? He went against his own personal interests. He could have given a loan, gotten credit for it, and gotten promoted. But he refused to do it and instead said, let's do it privately. So here's what happened. IFC, the private sector group, put $250 million in, which then attracted another $750 million. They sold the license to run the place to a French group, made money off that. And then over the past 9 years, there's been a total of more than $1 billion that has come into Jordan from the airport. They haven't had to pay a penny of debt service, and their debt to GDP ratio wasn't affected. So it came out really, really well. But it took a World Bank employee working directly against his own incentivized interest to do it. And so I talk about it. What's the name? John Speakman. How could I forget John Speakman? Because I use his name all the time, and he's like a celebrity now at the World Bank Group, right? And so the lesson here is that culture change in institutions is really hard. But what you say is absolutely valid, and the only hope to end poverty in the world is if we change that culture.
The young woman in the back.
Thank you so much, Dr. Kim. I am a bioengineering PhD student here.
I'm sorry,
we can't hear you. Can you say that again?
I am a bioengineering PhD student here at Stanford, originally from Ethiopia and passed through the medical school system there. I had a question about, investing in research and development in countries which are currently considered in poverty. And I feel like it's on the superficial seen as more of a luxury, but I'm personally thinking that it is one of the fundamental ways that a country can grow and you can eliminate poverty is by doing research and scientific discovery. So I wanted to get your idea on this and what policies or lookouts are around this area of investing in research.
We've had huge investments in higher education and research. And it was over the last 5 years that we've really scaled up our funds available for higher education institutions to do research. I think it's really important. I think it's going to be a big part of investing in your human capital. Now, I have to tell you, I think developing countries have to be really selective in the kinds of research that they do. If someone comes back and says, well, I was at Stanford and I had this great lab and I want to recreate it, if you're bringing in NIH funding into a lab in Ethiopia, then that's great. But I think people will look at it very carefully. And by the way, your new prime minister in Ethiopia is quite impressive. I hope you agree with me. I think there's, I knew all the previous ones, and Haile Mariam is a good guy and a good friend, but this guy, I think, is going to change things. And so what we tend to do is that when we see a leader who really looks promising, we tend to invest in them a lot. So we're planning on investing quite a bit in his vision, which is exciting. Yeah.
Thank you, Dr. Kim, for coming to speak. As you might know, last week was the first ever high-level meeting a UN high-level meeting on tuberculosis. And one of the key calls from activists, from NGOs, treatment providers, was to get heads of states to show up and really commit and to carry out those commitments to tackle TB. So it's really, there's only so much the World Bank and NGOs and academics can do to where really the governments have to be the one to carry this out. So with the Human Capital Index, it might be good, to put that pressure on for those people low index. But I was wondering if you give an example of maybe a sneak preview of one of the countries closer to the top of the index and a positive example and what it is that they're getting right in terms of education and health.
So let me give you an example very close to my heart, Korea, right? So I was born in 1959 in Korea, and in 1963, the Korea did not get a loan from the World Bank until 1963. And the reason is because the World Bank, and I've read these papers, from 59, 55, post-war Korea, oh my God, this country is so poor. All the industrial capacity is in the north. All the mineral wealth is in the north. There's no way that Korea would even be able to pay back the lowest interest rate loan to the World Bank. So they were not eligible for loans, right? So 63, the first loan for a road. 68, second loan was for education. And they were ridiculed by World Bank staff. These guys are crazy. What are they talking about? They need roads. They need railways. They're investing in education. Come on. And this was part of my critique of the bank, right? The ideology of the bank was first you go rich and then you invest in your people. Whereas Amartya Sen was saying the only countries that have really done well and gone from poor country to developed country are the ones that invested in their people before organizations like the World Bank thought they should, right? And so Korea is a great example of a country that caught it at the right time. They invested in their people. And they say, well, Korea and Japan are totally different. Japan had very high literacy rates in the 1890s, right? The ones you have to look at are Korea, China, and Japan that started off with very low levels of literacy. I mean, the literacy level in Korea in 1950 was less than 20%, right? The number of college graduates, less than 5%. So it started off as an incredibly poor, rural, not very well educated. And maybe it's culture, but they also took loans for it. They invested in it early. So those are great stories. Now, a lot of African countries, and Prime Minister Meles from Ethiopia, I met him before he died, and he said, we're going to be just like Korea. But industrially, it's not, that path is now blocked. I think most African countries are not going to be able to go through the stages of agriculture, light manufacturing, and heavy industry. They all want to be like Korea, and they think, what do we need to do? What are the policy things that we need to do? I don't think there's any policy miracles. What you have to really do is invest in your people, because it's never too late. And you have to start right now, and you have to use anything you can find in technology or to speed up the process of improving education and healthcare among your people. And then when you do that, you have no idea what the economy of the future will look like, but your people will be prepared. Right? So it's one of the countries at the very top of the list. Singapore is also there. Japan is also there. Interestingly, the former Soviet Union countries have done very well. Really interestingly, have done very well. Latin American countries have increased their expenditures on health and education, but haven't got much better. Middle Eastern countries as well. Lots of increased expenditure on health and education with not very much better outcomes. So in each of those regions, very difficult conversations will start. And what we hope is that we'll be able to come in and say, we're so glad you're asking these questions. Now let's take the next step and figure out how you can focus your investments so you actually get better. Yeah.
I think we have time for maybe one quick question. Kathy?
Hi. When you talk about preferential option for the poor, I wonder, how do you relate to global warming and what's happening there? Preferential option for the planet, for future generations. How do you relate those?
So it's the poor who suffer most, and today. So there's these arguments, these crazy arguments about is global warming real or not. There's not a single African head of state who won't tell you that the boot of climate change is on our necks right now. The cycles of droughts and flooding, the small island countries, oh my God, I mean, their very existence is threatened. So what we know over millennia, not just the last 50 years, is that when things are bad, at some level, the poor will always suffer the most. And so the most simplistic way we talk about it is, if we don't keep global warming below 2 degrees Celsius, an additional 100 million people a year will be pushed into poverty. Right? And so this is such a life or death issue for poor people that it's very much in our face. And so we went from spending almost nothing on climate change to now about a third of our portfolio has climate benefits. And so every road we build now is a climate smart road. Every hospital, every school we build has solar energy. And we have gone from being literally the outcasts. I mean, in Copenhagen in 2000, when was it, 11, we were not allowed into the room during the discussions because we were thought of as the bad guys. And now we're the largest financiers of climate change activities in the world by far. And this year we did 20 billion. And by 2020, we'll do almost 30 billion a year. Yeah.
So let me thank Dr. Kim and Dr. Wise for a scintillating conversation. And
the preceding program is copyrighted by the Board of Trustees of the Leland Stanford Junior University. Please visit us at med.stanford.edu.